All right, I'd like to interrupt the serving for a minute. I'm Rod Navarre, I'm with EMC, and I have the honor today to introduce Travis Sawchik. So you probably saw that he's got some books for sale outside, the Big Data Baseball Analytics book, which is about the Pittsburgh Pirates and their transformation. I have the opportunity to introduce him because, candidly, I've had an opportunity to work a fair amount with some of our baseball customers with EMC. In particular, I'm out of Cleveland, Ohio, and so the Cleveland Indians use our products today for their analytics, for their big data, for about everything that they do in the organization. 450 terabytes they currently have under management. And when I first started working with the Indians a few years ago, I introduced myself to them with a little bit of an understanding of their impact on big data and baseball analytics through the movie Moneyball. So for those of you that have seen that movie, you'll be aware that Brad Pitt flew out to Cleveland and he arguably poached their top analyst as part of a trade. So that was my introduction to the Indians, and it got a lot of laughter out of them because apparently, although there's some truth to that story, I think Hollywood did a little bit of embellishment on exactly how that went down. But today, the Cleveland Indians have 4 or 5 full-time staffers that just run analytics on everything. A lot of the analytics that they do relates to every single position of a baseball player on the field. Now, they'll tell me, a lot of these players will embrace the idea of where they stand and how they stand no matter what batter's up. And then there's the other players that are just so athletic, they couldn't care less. And they just do what they do. But what was insightful to me is the Cleveland Indians actually started some big data analytics in baseball well before Moneyball with a product called Diamond View. And Diamond View is actually used today in a different form, not only by many of the baseball teams, but it's actually moved its way into the NFL with a number of the big teams, including the Dallas Cowboys, maybe a bad example this year. But Diamond View was brought into being at the Cleveland Indians in 1998. So it's 17 years old now. And that was really the foundation of sports teams looking very in-depthly at the data that gets generated in every move, in every play, in every player. So with that background, I'd like to ask Travis to come up to share a little bit about his book and his experiences. And knowing that the Business Association Management Group, which is of baseball, all of MLB, currently uses EMC's products for all their data storage and their analytics. And the story that he'll be telling here about the Pirates is a big part of that. So Travis?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me today. Honored to be here. And it's humbling to think that such an illustrious congregation here thinks they might be able to learn something from my book. I just apologize that Jennifer and Elise couldn't find someone more handsome to speak to you during your lunch hour. But here we are. And I'll just start. I'm also a sports reporter covering the Pirates for the Pittsburgh Trib, and I started there in 2013, which was a fortunate time to start there because the Pirates, of course, went into that season with a 20-year losing streak, which was a North American sports record for futility. No one had ever had 20 straight losing seasons. So I started there, and I went into that season thinking, the Pirates, they have Garrett Cole in their system, they have Jamison Tyne, they have some top prospects, they have a promising future, but there weren't a lot of expectations for 2013, and there's a lot of pressure on the front office and organization to turn things around. They brought back most of the returning roster, the 25-man rosters, mostly the same parts that were there year before when they had their 20th straight losing season. And as the spring turned into summer, they kept winning. They, of course, went on to win 94 games and end that streak, get into playoffs. And along the way, it was basically the same roster and the same composition from a year before. How did they turn themselves around without adding a lot of? There were no big dollar free agents. There wasn't a lot of help from the farm system. There was not a lot of help internally. How did they turn that around? So that became a really interesting question, and I wrote several articles in the Trib about it, and they're well received. And I thought maybe this is bigger. This is a bigger story than what we can fit in a newspaper, a Sunday section. and it's said that sports writing is sort of the toy department of human affairs, but once in a while there is an important story, I think, and I thought this was one. So I think we start with the question: why did the Pirates turn to data? What led them there? And I think it's really necessity is the mother of all invention. And if you go back to October of 2012, you're looking at a club that and a leadership group that was under fire. A lot of people in Pittsburgh wanted Neil Huntington gone. They wanted a regime change. They wanted Clint Hurdle gone. They wanted everyone gone, a fresh start. This was another losing season, 20th straight losing season. So there's a lot of pressure to have an immediate turnaround in 2013. So if you go back to October 2012, Neil Huntington, the general manager of Pirates, who runs their front office operations, and Clint Hurdle, the manager, I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. They had a meeting at Hurdle's house in the North Hills in Pittsburgh right after the season ended, and they understood the problem. They looked at what they were returning. They looked at the 25-man roster. They understood there's going to be no David Price, $200 million free agent riding in on a white horse. They understood most of their top prospects in the farm system were still a year away. They had to be. It was really a problem of efficiency. They had their 25-man roster, their 40-man roster. They had to extract more wins without adding much more payroll, without adding a lot of external help. So they had their meeting at Hurdle's home, and they attacked that problem. Where could we get better? Where could we become more efficient? What were we not maximizing? And that's where they really turned to data. They had, when Huntington first arrived here, one of the first things he wanted built was a proprietary database. He had been familiar with it. He had become acquainted with it in Cleveland when he was there as an assistant front office staff member, and he built it in 2008 when he came aboard, but it had been underutilized. The data had been underutilized. So that meeting really turned their attention to making the most of the data. And Moneyball, I'm sure many of the sports fans here are familiar with, was a story about the Oakland A's about a decade earlier. And the A's, also another small market team with not a lot of financial resources, they also turned to data to turn their program around. And they were focused on how to add runs. Where would data show hidden value on offense and run production? The Pirates turned their focus, and it began in Hurdle's home in October of 2012. They turned their focus to run prevention. Where could data help them prevent runs? Because runs lead to wins, and if you can prevent more, that will lead to wins without adding payroll, and that's really where the story began, where the book begins. And a lot had changed since Moneyball. The Oakland A's were taking advantage of a statistic you could find on the back of a baseball card, on-base percentage. It was not valued properly. On-base percentage, simply the ability to avoid making an out. And I don't want to get too wonky here for people that aren't familiar with baseball, but they took advantage of a statistic, a measurement that was not properly valued. And it was a best-selling book, movie, everything, and it worked out, at least in the regular season, quite well. But so much had changed since those 2003 Oakland A's teams. So much data had come into the game. You look at systems like MLB BAM, StatCast, Sport Visions, PitchFX. There's just been this avalanche of data coming into the game. And I want to go all the way back to Bill James, who was the first. This is late 70s. He's really kind of the father of bringing more information to the game, the father of sabermetrics, the idea of using data to objectively measure and understand baseball performance. And if you go back to the 70s, there was just newspaper box scores. The way the game was measured and evaluated did not change much in its 100-year history up to that point. And he understood that to better understand baseball, to better measure baseball, to better evaluate performance, there had to be more data. So in his 1984 baseball abstract, he had begun publishing these books, these encyclopedias of baseball information, and a small niche audience had become interested in them. In 1984, he called upon his readership to begin Project Scoresheet, which required stringers across the country to enter they were going to take every batted ball in a baseball game, all the play-by-play data, defenders' positioning, where balls landed, and they were going to compile all this in a computer system, and it would give them a better idea of the nature of batted balls, defenders' performance, all sorts of things. Because this didn't exist, there wasn't a great understanding of defensive performance. It was just people understood defenders' value by errors, which is a very subjective measure. So that's where really the defense. So score sheet gets online. Stringers across the country are entering data into this computer software system. They're using a rough template grid, and the data points jump up. If you go back 1951, according to Sean Lehman's research, there are about 1,800 data points in baseball per season. Just the number of players times the number of statistical categories. When Bill James begins publishing his baseball abstracts in the early 1980s, there's about 200,000 data points. And then when Project Score Sheet gets online, there are about 1 million as there's more defensive metrics, more measurements coming online. So Score Sheet is really the first attempt to better understand defensive performance, and it jumps up the data points. And then 2008, there's another huge jump when PitchFX comes along, SportVision's pitch tracking software system that, if you're familiar with the ESPN K-Zone product, it shows where pitches cross the plate, and SportVision wanted to improve that and show not just where pitches cross the plate, but their movement, have a uniform velocity. So that came online in 2008. That had 20 million data points, and in 2015 we have StatCast, and it's 2.4 billion data points per season, according to Lehman. So we see this, incredible rise in data, and that's really what had changed since Moneyball. There's just been such this huge avalanche of data coming into the game, and the thing was, the Pirates had stored a lot of this in their database. It was built in 2008. Every MLB team had the same access to SportVision's PitchFX system, to all this information that was coming into the game, but no one was really using it. The Pirates weren't maximizing it. This ability, this understanding of how to better prevent runs, no one was really using it, and this is where Hurdle and Huntington in that meeting really turned their focus. Huntington had been sort of, he'd accepted sabermetric database thought. Hurdle was more of a traditional. He looks like a traditional guy. He's got that gray porcupine-like hair. He's from the old. He came up through the old school. He was a first-round pick of the Royals back in the '70s. He's a smart guy, but he didn't go to school. His whole life was in pro ball. And when his playing career was over, the players didn't make enough money at that time to just quit working. He went into coaching because that was usually plan B for ex-players. So he was a very traditional guy. He managed for the Rockies, and there was no full-time data analyst with the Rockies in the mid-2000s when he was there. So he was never exposed to this. When he came on board with the Pirates, he kept the data at arm's length. He didn't trust it. But it was, again, think back, 20 straight losing seasons, jobs might be at stake with the 21st. It's a necessity, and Hurdle took another look. Huntington came to him with these ideas, and it was at that meeting in October 2012 when they decided to go all in with this run prevention approach that ultimately leads to their turnaround. So, but a lot had to happen from that point. They had to get a lot of buy-in from coaches, players, and I think a really important part of this story is collaboration. Because every team had the same numbers, the same access to data, but there's a lot of resistance throughout baseball. There's the old school and the new school, and they're often at odds. They had different biases. There were different sorts of people from different walks of life, and in most clubs, a lot of times these people would, in different parts of the organization, would not trust each other. They would not come together. So the first hurdle for the Pirates was collaboration, and it took, I think, a special group of people to make this work. And I want to talk about some of the main characters. We talked about Huntington a little bit already, but he was with the Cleveland Indians as an assistant when he became familiar with Diamond View, which was the first attempt in baseball to have a database on site. And John Hart, who was the GM there. Mark Shapiro was an assistant. They brought these big bulky binders to the winter meetings, and it held all the information on player scouting reports, medical reports, opponents, players, and their evaluations. They wanted all this in a computerized system that they could quickly, easily access throughout the season, and that's where the idea was born. Huntington saw the value in Cleveland in the late '90s, and when he came to Cleveland, or when he came to Pittsburgh in 2000, at the end of 2007, it was one of the first things he wanted built. He saw the value in it. And this is also a few years after Moneyball and the story of the A's. So people were beginning to understand the value, but it didn't exist. He had to build it from scratch, and he had to find someone to build it. And the Pirates were on a budget, so he needed a data architect, and he also needed a data analyst, and he only had money for one, and he found Dan Fox to fill both those roles initially. And Fox is a really fascinating guy. He grew up in Durant, Iowa, small, idyllic Midwestern town. He did not go to a fancy university. He went to Iowa State. He got a computer science degree there. He was a well-rounded person. His mother made him play in the band. He played baseball in the neighborhood. He loved the Cubs, and he was exposed to, I think it was the Osborne. He was exposed to his dad was a banker in town, and he brought home one of the first portable computers. I think it was the Osborne. I can't remember the name exactly, but Fox had this love for baseball, and his dad exposed him to this computer, and it became really a great match. But at that time, there was not decision sciences were not part of baseball front offices. So he went off to Iowa State, got his computer science degree, and began working for companies like Chevron and Quilogy. He was a data architect, and he did that for the first decade or so of his professional life. But one thing that always stood out about Fox is he was such a good communicator. And at one point in the early 2000s, one of his coworkers said, Dan, you should start writing a blog because you're really good at communicating ideas. You're different than a lot of math people I know. You have this great 1,000-foot view of things, and you're a really good speaker and communicator. You should try blogging. So Fox wrote a few blogs. He created a blog and wrote a few entries about data architecture and what he was doing, and he was sort of bored. He wasn't inspired to write. And then he wrote a blog about baseball and I think it was a bunt analysis piece, and he thought it was a lot of fun. He wrote another one, and then this niche audience of baseball nerds and the internet, they found Dan Fox's blog, and they said, wow, this guy's writing some interesting things. So the Hardball Times noticed Dan Fox. It's a baseball analyst blog, and they brought Fox on to write for free. He was still doing his day job, but as a hobbyist, he began writing data-based analyst pieces for the Hardball Times. Then Baseball Prospectus, a more prestigious analysis site, they brought on Fox to write. Still had his day job. He was in Colorado at this point, but they paid him to write articles. He wrote 100 articles for Baseball Prospectus, and the industry began to notice. The Pirates began to notice, and his ideas were so good. Baseball Prospectus still uses his metrics to evaluate base running. He began writing about defensive shifts at Baseball Prospectus, and he was really a bright guy. Will Carroll, who worked there, called Fox one of the 3 brightest people he's ever known, and Fox began his first column. He titled his column at Baseball Prospectus Schrodinger's Bat instead of cat, and his first column began, Schrodinger made people think deeply about what they knew or thought they knew about the nature of reality itself. I do hope through this column we can devise some clever experiments that put to test both conventional and sabermetric wisdom and help us think more deeply about our shared distraction, which is baseball, of course. So that's what he's been doing for years. That's what he's been doing at the Pirates. He's been testing both data-based and conventional ideas. He's been using data as a tool. He's been asking a lot of the right questions and using it as a resource. So I think he understood what Grace Hopper, one of the first computer programmers understood, and that is it's no use knowing math if you can't communicate with people. So not only is he a really bright guy, he's a really great communicator, and I think Clint Hurdle had to be around an analyst like that to accept the findings. And in the second half of 2012, Hurdle, very traditional baseball man, and Fox started to meet more often in Hurdle's office during pregame scouting. Before every baseball series, the manager and his assistants meet to go over the opponent, create a lineup, go over game plans, that sort of thing. So before that meeting, he began to invite Fox in more often to talk about things. And he was aware of some of Fox's ideas, but they also talked about a lot of things that weren't related to baseball at all. They had shared interests. They're both devout Christians. They're into military history. Fox has visited Gettysburg. He's gone on the Civil War battle site tour. So Hurdle saw that Fox was not the stereotypical Saturday Night Live IT guy. This guy had depth to him. He was interesting, and he began to trust him. I think Fox called it time exposure, where the more they were around, the more they trusted each other. So the frequency of these meetings picked up through. They began early in 2012. Picked up more, and by that October, when he meets with Huntington at his North Hills home, he trusts Fox, and I think he's more open to these ideas, and that dovetails in with we need some help, and I have to be open to ideas, or I might not be around in 2014. So those are really two. That relationship is so important, and it leads to the collaboration. When he agrees to go all in with some of these data-based run prevention ideas, he's the gatekeeper. You can have the best ideas in the world, but if you don't have a manager willing to have the expectation that his assistant coaches, that his players will use them, then the data serves no purpose. It's not working. So Hurdle becomes an important gatekeeper. And as spring training opens, in Bradenton, Florida, in the spring of 2013, the whole organization, the major league players, the coaching staff, they meet in the Pirate City, the spring training complex. They meet in the cafeteria, as they do every year. Hurdle has his opening speech. Only this time, he introduces some new faces. Fox and his assistant, Mike Fitzgerald, who's 24 years old, brilliant quantitative analyst from MIT. He has them stand up, he introduces them, and he says, we're going to listen to these people. They're going to be around all year. They're here to help you. They're a resource. You're not better than them. They're here to answer your questions, and you have to respect them. They respect you, and they're going to be around. And one thing the Pirates did differently than a lot of clubs is they really integrated Fox and Fitzgerald into the clubhouse. They were not off hidden in a separate department. They were there. They became more familiar. Just as they became more familiar to Hurdle, they became more familiar to players and coaches, and that became important for trust, and for that collaborative effort, as I'll get to later. And so Hurdle set this expectation early at the first meeting of the spring training in 2013, that we're going to listen to these people. You're going to listen to these people, and these are the expectations, because they're really smart guys. And they have some really important ideas. And the first important idea was defensive shifting. And if you followed baseball, you've probably noticed over the last few seasons that often, traditionally, there's two players on the right side of second base and two defenders on the left side of second base. A third baseman, a shortstop are on the left side, a first baseman, a second baseman are on the right side of first base. And it was that way for 100 years. But as you've probably noticed, if you follow the sport over the last few years, there's often three defenders on one side of second base. Alignment has changed dramatically. And one of the first areas the Pirates wanted to attack in their run prevention plan was to change their defensive alignment. And this goes back to Fox's work with Baseball Prospectus. One of the first things you wrote about there was how defenses are not aligned properly, and this is proven by data. If you go back to Project Score Sheet, which led to John DeWan eventually ran that. He eventually created his own company, Baseball Info Solutions, that came up with defensive alignment software based off data. It showed that for 100 years, defenders had been in the wrong place. Most balls hit on the ground by a batter in baseball are hit to a pull side. So a right-handed hitter hits it to the left side, a left-handed hitter hits it to the right side. So 60-70% of ground balls are usually hit to the pull side, but defenses have been aligned that batted balls, ground balls were equally dispersed across the infield. And they'd done that for about 100 years, or more than 100 years, and no one had really ever challenged it until the middle of the last decade. So that was the first thing they were going to attack, was the defensive shifts. And Fox, once he was told that offseason that we're going to take you seriously, you and Mike Fitzgerald, we're going to listen to you, they began to think about how can we democratize this data, how can we make it accessible to players so they'll buy into it. And they began to think visually how to present data. But Fox, when he had been around players, he had understood that they were excellent visual learners, and he thought about, well, we can't give them spreadsheets with numbers. We need to think visually about how to present this. So they went to color-coded charts, data density charts. Where were ground balls hit? Where were balls hit? And they came up with these scouting reports to give to players. And in spring training, they gave scouting reports of familiar opponents, like Jay Bruce of the Cincinnati Reds. And they showed where he hit ground balls. And it looked like he was a left-handed hitter. So most ground balls were hit to his pull side, and on these color-coded density charts, it looked like a thunderstorm cell was on the right side of the infield, and Bruce was 90% of his ground balls were hit to his pull side, and I think that resonated with players. Just the visualization, the presentation was important. It couldn't just be Hurdle saying, you got to listen to this. It had to make sense. They had to see it visually and have it make sense. So that was one of the first things Fox did, was Fox and Fitzgerald came up with a better way to present the data. And as spring training went on, they tested this. They aligned themselves in positions, and they began to get a better sense of it. And they began to buy in, especially early in the season when they began to have some anecdotal success. They really began to buy in. The second part of the plan was collaboration is such an important part of the story. And it's important to note the Pirates weren't the first team to really make this wholesale move to shifting their defense, to aligning it in a different manner that had been done for 100 years. The Tampa Bay Rays had done it first in the American League. The Brewers had done it first in the National League. But the Pirates are the first team to try to have more balls hit on the ground through this systematic approach that has to begin on the pitcher's mound. If you're going to shift your defense, if most ground balls are pooled, you want as many ground balls as possible. So as they collaborated in the offseason, how can we maximize shifts? This is a story of efficiency. We want a more efficiently aligned defense, and we want more balls hit into that defense. So how do we produce more ground balls? Well, you start by identifying ground ball pitchers, and ground ball rates are easily accessible on any baseball reference webpage. But they identified pitchers like that, that they wanted. But they also wanted to teach it. So they had pitchers trade in a 4-seam fastball, which is usually the highest velocity pitch, for a 2-seam fastball, which moves at a slightly slower velocity, but has more movement and it produces more ground balls. So this became the second tenet of their run prevention philosophy was going to be the ground ball rate. So they identified these pitchers, they taught it. And one of the really cool collaboration stories is Fox and Fitzgerald interacting with the assistant staff. Because you think of Moneyball, you think of the analytics departments, you think of the front offices these days dictating top down, here's how we're going to do things. The data, we understand this game better than you ex-players do. The data tells us this, and we have all the answers. I think that's like a very standard narrative right now. But Hurdle didn't want that. Huntington didn't want that. And Fox and Fitzgerald didn't want that. Hurdle wanted Fox and Fitzgerald embedded to create trust, to create conversation. And he wanted it to be a two-way street. He wanted his assistant coaches to feel empowered because they had this experience of playing and living the game and having these experiences of standing in the batter's box, beat on the field that he thought mattered, that the analysts didn't have. And what happened with the ground ball rate is the coaches, eventually their trust level came up as they see Fox and Fitzgerald around the clubhouse more often, and they start to ask questions, and they have their own theories they want tested. And Jeff Bannister, who is now the Texas Rangers manager, he was part of the coaching staff that wanted Fox and Fitzgerald to test something with their data. They believed that if you sequence pitches a certain way to batters, that they'd be more apt to hit a ground ball. and they believed that if you pitched inside early in an at-bat and go away later, you create a fear factor where their batters are not going to take batters will take a less forceful swing in the box. They'll be more tentative if you pitch them inside and create that fear factor. And Fox and Fitzgerald had never played at a high level. They had not really considered that, and say, okay, we'll take a look. And sure enough, with all the data that's available, all the pitch tracking, you can go and look at every individual batter and see what happens when they were sequenced a certain way with pitches. And it turned out their ground ball rate did go up if they were sequenced a certain way. And the coaching staff also asked for the top location spots and pitch types for ground balls, but the key thing was the sequencing. So they brought all these ideas together. We want pitchers who throw ground balls. We want to teach pitchers to throw ground balls, and we want to teach sequencing in a certain way to produce more ground balls, hit into more shifts. And the sequencing would not have happened unless this trust was built, unless this collaboration was built between the assistant staff, traditional baseball men, and the new age analysts. And what happened in 2013 is the Pirates, they produced an MLB, since it's been recorded, they produced an MLB record ground ball rate of 52.5%, which was 4% better than the number 2 team, the Cardinals, at 48, and the MLB average was 44%. So it's a standard deviation or two better, and you think of it, maybe it doesn't sound like a glaring number, but that's hundreds of more balls over the course of a season hit on the ground, and they increase their shift usage by 500% because of the data-based alignment charts. So now you have this record high ground ball rate being hit into this much more aggressive defensive alignment. And what's really interesting is in 2012, their defensive runs saved, a defensive metric calculated to measure defensive performance, they were 23 runs below the major league average. With the shifting and the ground ball philosophy combined, they improved to, I think it was 65 runs above it. So they made a 90-run improvement without adding $1 in payroll through coupling the shifts and the data-based alignment charts. And that's a dramatic turnaround. That's 90 runs is equivalent to 9 wins. About 10 runs is equal to 1 win. According to today's analysts. And think about 9 wins on the free agent market. 1 win above replacement is worth about $7.5 million. That's $60-some million that they didn't add anyone. They just implemented these strategies, and they got 9 wins, and again, that's an enormous performance value. And that helps them move from 79 wins in 2012 to get to that 94 number they finished with in 2013 to get into the wild card game and end that losing streak of losing seasons. So those were 2 important run prevention prongs. The third was a player acquisition. The first 2 were largely internal. They were not adding anyone. The third was an external addition, and Russell Martin, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And he was a free agent in the 2012-2013 offseason. He was a free agent catcher he had been with the New York Yankees the year before. And the Pirates, they don't have much money to spend, small market team, attendance wasn't great, TV contract isn't great. They didn't have a tremendous amount of resources that offseason, so they had to find value. And they began, just as the A's had looked at on base as undervalued, the Pirates were looking at the free agent market and thinking, what skills are undervalued? Who is out there that we could bring in and make an impact at a value price? And that Fox and Fitzgerald that summer had begun looking at this, and they had been intrigued by this idea of pitch framing that is tied to the Sport Vision pitch effects system. Really the first automated big data tool in baseball. And again, pitch effects tracks the location of every pitch that's shown in Major League Baseball. And it's been surpassed by the MLB BAM StatCast. But in 2008, it was in every park, it was cutting edge, and it was flooding millions of data points about every pitch. So all of a sudden, in 2008, you have every pitch location in baseball. And Sport Vision had produced this for MLB BAM. And the interesting thing is, these outside hobbyists had begun to scrape the site and take this data for themselves to play around with it on their websites. And Sportvision CEO thought about stopping this and said, hey, you can't just scrape this data off our site. But he thought, well, this could be good for our product. I'll let these hobbyists toy around with it on their blogs and see what they can come up with it. It's good advertising for our product. And so hundreds of outside hobbyists for fun start playing around with the PitchFX data, the location, trajectories, velocities, all of that. And some of the first interesting research was tied to umpire bias. Where does each major league umpire have a bias, and what part of the strike zone do they call a high strike, a low strike, inside, outside? And then the next wave of analysis came to catchers. Which catchers are better at framing pitches? The idea of receiving a pitch in a way that it's perceived to be a strike if it's outside the strike zone, or keeping strike calls called strikes that look like they're moving away from the strike zone. Is this a quantifiable skill? And traditional baseball men had thought it was a quantifiable skill. Data analysts had been skeptical until this technology came online. For example, the Moneyball A's, they did not value catcher defense because you could not measure it. But this technology allowed to look at which catchers were better at keeping balls in the strike zone called as strikes and stealing borderline pitches outside the zone and having them called a strike. And you have to understand there's a dramatic difference between a 2-ball and 1-strike count and, say, a 1-ball and 2-strike count. It's like 150 points of batting average. So if you have the skill to the sleight of hand to have more pitches called as strikes, it's a dramatic. The accumulation effect is dramatic over the course of a season. And so Fox and Fitzgerald became curious about some of the outside research hobbyists were doing, and they did their own stress tests on it, and they became comfortable with it in 2012, in the late summer of 2012. And one of the guys who was the best free agent catcher at stealing strikes was Russell Martin, who had a very poor offensive year with the Yankees. He had batted 220, wasn't receiving much interest, and no one really wanted the guy. But he was an amazing receiver. And the Pirates had one of the worst receiving catchers the year before. Rod Barajas and Ryan Domit, the last several seasons, had been at the bottom of these framing metrics. They were, according to the analysis done, they were costing their teams 3 wins per year just because they're poor receiving, where Russell Martin was adding 2 or 3 wins per year for the Yankees through his glove work. So they signed Russell Martin to a 2-year, $17 million deal. It was a club record for an outside free agent, and it left a lot of people in Pittsburgh scratching what are they doing? This guy hit 220 last year. He's washed up. He's done. But he used the third prong of this run prevention strategy of the ground balls, the shifts, and now they add Russell Martin. And just through the database find, the importance of his glove, it's another 4 or 5 win turnaround from the Barajas and Domit level to Martin. So you add up the receiving improvement, you add up the impact of the ground balls and the shifts, and all of a sudden you have 14, 15 wins added, and the only payroll added was a relatively modest amount to Russell Martin. And those were the 3 key strategies I outline in this book. And look, every team in baseball had access to the same information. Anyone could have implemented these ideas, but the Pirates were the first to bet on Russell Martin. They were the first to have this ground ball strategy combined with their shifts. They weren't the first team to shift, but they were the first team to try to maximize it through ground ball rates. And any team could have done this. All the data was out there, but how did they do that? They went about it through collaboration, which was lacking throughout baseball. They had the right people. And that collaboration led to asking the right questions, which I think is really important of anything. But if you have a huge pile of data, and in today's world, you can't just look at the back of a baseball card to understand a player. You have to dive into this data. You have to ask the right questions of it to come up with new ways to understand the game, new ways to evaluate players. So everyone has the same data pile, but who asks the best questions of it? And I think over the last 3 years, the Pirates have asked the best questions, or been among the best in the game at asking the right questions. And they've moved on to preventative health measures, looking at players' fatigue level. So they keep looking for new areas to exploit. And they have this, the Pirates were a little uncomfortable about this book because no one wants to give away their secret sauces or recipes for success. And by the time the book came out, a lot of baseball insiders were familiar with the pitch framing, the catch framing. Data research had been done. Shifts had begun to proliferate the game. So a lot of that was out there and was known. What the Pirates, I think, were concerned about was how the internal workings, relationships, how Fox and Fitzgerald worked with Clint Hurdle, how they created this collaborative effort with the assistant coaches and analysts talking to each other, coming up with new ideas, asking the right questions. I think that's what concerned them a little bit. Other teams would try to replicate that, but I still think you have to have the right people in any walk of life, and they had the right people. They had, Fox was a really such an interesting guy, such an able communicator. He was able to communicate ideas and create trust. And you had Hurdle, who was willing to accept these ideas, willing to change, willing to get his assistant staff along. So you can have the best data in the world, you can have the smartest people in the world, but you still have to have the right people. You still have to have collaboration, to ask the right questions and make the most of data, I think, in any industry. And I think that's what the Pirates did, and I think that was really the key to their success over the last 3 years, or at least one of the keys. So I think I have to wrap up here, but yeah, that's I think, again, collaboration, asking the right questions, that's what, as I dove into this, that's what I thought some of the most powerful lessons to come up the book were. So yeah, thanks again for your time and having me speak today.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. Love it when you probably big that T-shirt.